This session is going to look at the progress that's been made so far, how to get the detail of the assessment right, and the implications and opportunities for your individual firms. Now, since last year, a lot of progress has been made. The SRA has made a number of changes in response to feedback from you, from this sector. For instance, it has committed to the need for a degree or equivalent, as well as a 2-year period of work experience and a beefed up assessment of skills as well as knowledge. It's now committed, as you know, to going ahead with the SQE, but there's still a lot of work to make sure that the detail is right, and that's one of the reasons why this session is so important. Now, unfortunately, Julie Brannan can't join us today. Crispin Passmore, the Executive Director of Policy at the SRA, is here to talk you through the next steps. But before he does, we've got a short video to show to you this morning explaining what opportunities there might be for firms like yours with the SQE. So this should work if I click the green clicker.
As an SME law firm, we don't have an army of HR professionals and L&D professionals. So with the more simplified and flexible approach of the SQE, it's going to hopefully reduce the burden of administering a training contract. Ultimately, we can enable our staff to specialize quicker into their chosen field and therefore align their training to the needs of the business, which will ultimately impact on better client service, which is what we're all trying to achieve.
As a niche firm, we know that aspiring solicitors are attracted to us because of the type of work that we do. And we believe that our ability to both recruit and retain will be positively impacted because of the changes that the SQE will bring.
We partner with a number of schools in Cardiff, and the perception amongst pupils is that there's just one traditional route to becoming a lawyer, and that switches off a lot of pupils from becoming a lawyer. To offer work experience, vocational training, apprenticeships and real life work experience that counts for something and can attribute and people can build on to becoming a lawyer will only be a good thing for the profession. On that basis then, if they are going to change their career and switch their career, it's quite difficult for them to do that under the current regime. So it means going back to university, perhaps taking time out of their financial commitments. We believe the SQE can offer a much smoother transition for people to move into the legal sector at various stages of their career.
On the one hand, we have about 80% of small businesses and consumers not being able to get the legal help that they need. And on the other, we have about 7 out of 10 law graduates not getting training contracts, so they don't get to fulfill their dream to become solicitors. So I think the SQE in the first place is going to mean that a lot more solicitors are going to qualify and help to meet this unmet need.
What route you take to qualify as a solicitor, you've all got to be confident, we've got to be confident, and the public's got to be confident that anyone that has that title reaches that same standard. High professional standard for every solicitor, wherever they practice, however they got there. And that, to me, seems to be the starting point for what we're trying to do with the Solicitors Qualifying Exam. If we can do that through a centralised assessment, it becomes the mechanism that also allows us to open up the routes to deliver the flexibility in pathways to becoming a solicitor that we've started to see over the last 10 or 20 years, but the system is constrained. We've seen concentrated LPCs, we've seen law degrees combined with training contracts, we've seen a whole range of different ways of managing those different parts of the system at the moment, as well as apprenticeships, as well as legal executive routes into being a solicitor as well. But without that control of the standard, without that control of a very high standard for each individual solicitor, whatever route they come, we can't be clear to deliver the greater flexibility that we think firms need and certainly individual solicitors would aspire to. So what I want to try and cover today is some of the practical implementation, update you on where we are in the journey that we started 4 years ago on reforming education and training, and what the detail is over the 3 years or so through to implementation. So first of all, the milestones. As I say, we started back in 3-4 years ago thinking about reforming continual professional development and moving on quickly to look at what are the possibilities to deliver a new centralised assessment. We've consulted regularly, we've had formal consultations, we've had sessions like this with hundreds and thousands of lawyers, but also with educators, different sorts of organisations involved in training, and importantly with students, newly qualified solicitors and aspiring trainee solicitors as well. We're now at the stage where our board has made the decision to go ahead with the SQE, and we're now in the consultation phase for the finer development of the assessment over the next year or two. At the moment, we're making decisions on the final regulations that will allow us to implement that, and we would expect to have the LSB consider and approve those rules either towards the end of this year or early next year. That allows us to then focus quite quickly on making a final decision on who our assessment partner is, the expert organisation or organisations that we work with to really develop the assessment, to test it, to evaluate it, to make sure that it really works in practice over the next 2 years through until starting SQE in 2020. Alongside that, we need to develop the toolkit. We need to make sure that you as firms, the trainee students, careers advisors, all of the people involved in this have the right information to make the decisions they need to make through until 2020. And if we go with a launch in 2020, the last chance to start under the existing route will be August of that year. Perhaps it'll move on. Oh no, twice at a time. Okay, some of you might have seen this slide before. There's 4 key parts to qualifying as a solicitor in the future. The first, as Clive says, is a degree or equivalent qualification or experience. You might remember that in our early consultations, we questioned the need for that if we were confident about our standards and confident about our assessment. But we heard very clearly from law firms that they thought it was right that the vast majority of new solicitors should and would have a degree. So you will see that that's clearly part of our expectation now. The second is stage 1 and stage 2 of SQE. I'll give you a little bit more detail on where we are with that. The third is a substantial period of work experience. Again, we were open about whether or not this really needed to be 2 years. Was a shorter period viable? Would that be enough to give people the experience in practice that would allow them to pass an assessment? But many of you told us that you thought that 2 years was the right level. So on consideration of that consultation, we settled on the existing 2 years, a genuinely substantial period of work experience, but more flexibility about how that work experience can be gained. And of course, for any solicitor, if we're going to have high professional standards, they need to be of satisfactory character and suitability. And our current consultation on reforming our handbook includes rethinking that test to make sure that it sets the right standards, but gives us flexibility about opportunities for rehabilitation, taking the right facts into account to assess against that clear standard. Encourage you all to look at that and respond to the consultation. So what do we know, given that there's a period of time, almost 3 years before SQE is likely to go live? What do we actually know for certain at the moment? Well, we're very clear about those 3 on the left-hand side, the competence statement, the knowledge statement, and the threshold standard. If you look on our website, you will see a detailed competence statement and knowledge statement that sets out the areas of competence, the level of knowledge that you need, what is the areas of law that you need to understand to qualify as a solicitor and to pass the assessment. And the threshold standard tells you the depth of that knowledge as well. Those 3 documents are available. You can be working from those documents at the moment. We've used them to develop a draft assessment specification. Often people say to us, but I need some detail. This is 80 pages of detail, and this is what we're using to design the assessment against. This is what the assessment methodologies will test against. It's draft because we think there's more work to do with our assessment partner, with you, through the testing and the design phase over the next year or two. But that is the core of it, and I would encourage you all to look at that. We also know how it's being assessed. SQE Stage 1 and SQE Stage 2. So let me talk a little bit about those two sectors as well. Lucky we haven't reformed clickers yet. Okay. So SQE Stage 1. You might recognise some of these areas. They map in some ways across to what's in the legal practice course at the moment, but I'd encourage you not to be misled by that link to the legal practice course. This is a broader assessment of knowledge than that. This looks at the law, the foundations of law, procedure, practice of law, and brings it all together in the first time. So ending this, I think, artificial separation between learning about law as an undergraduate and learning about legal procedure in the LPC. So if we take property law and practice, for example, of course that covers residential conveyancing and commercial property transactions, but it also covers things like land law and property law, equity and trust, a whole range of areas that sit behind those transactions as well, and the procedures involved around property as well. I encourage you, if you want to go and look at the assessment practice draft assessment, you can see the detail of each of these areas, and you can send us your views on that. Many people have worried that this is just a multiple choice questions. It's a more sophisticated assessment than that. It also tests legal skills through legal research and writing skills, and a mixture of short form questions and multiple choice as well. Woven throughout this assessment will be ethics questions. There won't simply be, within that first bullet of principles of professional conduct, a section on ethics with a big red flag, because that's not the reality of practice. Ethical questions don't arise with a neat heading and a neat guide to them in the real world. So the ethical questions will be woven throughout the assessment in both Stage 1 and Stage 2. And I think that's a really important step in making sure that everyone that gets that solicitor badge really has earned it and is at the right standard. I think as we've talked to other jurisdictions around the world about their centralised assessments, and many of them already have that, the thing that's been really interesting is how many of them are jealous of our ability to introduce a practical legal skills assessment. Because really, this is the key that takes the knowledge and makes it useful to clients. Being able to interview, persuade, write, all of the things that you do day in, day out. We've learned quite a lot through our qualified lawyer transfer scheme for foreign lawyers coming into England and Wales for how to develop this. We've seen other professions use similar methods as well. And it's becoming an increasingly standard way of assessing competence amongst professions. And I think we will see it used increasingly around the rest of the world as well. This is a 2-day, probably, assessment. It really is a robust process with a mixture of lawyers, actors, assessors involved in making sure that each candidate is good enough for each of these different areas. There is no shortcut to becoming a solicitor under this route. It really is about maintaining those standards consistently across the cohort from year to year, from different forms of practice to other forms of practice. But as I say, we've kept substantial work experience at 2 years. I think this is a really important area. With clear standards and with an assessment that we're confident in, you could make a case for not requiring any qualifying work experience, but we think that that's where you learn really how to put it into practice. You learn the practical work of a solicitor, the ethical framework that lawyers need to work under, and the development of those competencies and what it really means when confronted with a client. How do you balance the different issues? How do you identify and resolve ethical issues when you've got a client and pressure from your partner to deliver particular things for your clients? We want to make sure that the SQE2 assessment at the appropriate point in that journey, assesses the competencies that people have had the opportunity to learn through their qualifying work experience. And each individual candidate will need to be signed off by the CULP in a regulated firm or a solicitor elsewhere to say that the qualifying work experience has been good enough, that it gives people the opportunity to learn about ethical practice, be assimilated into the profession, and to develop the competencies that we all expect. Now, there could be many routes. As I said, one of the beauties for us of SQE is it gives us real flexibility to allow you to develop training routes that suit your firm. Whether you're working with vulnerable clients and legal aid, whether you're working in a tech-savvy business with a very different sort of client group in a very different service, you need different sorts of lawyers. You need them trained in different ways. But the core has to be the same. So that allows you and educators to develop different pathways and different training modules to get people beyond the core to suit your firm. But there will still be a core route that we think many, many lawyers will continue, at least for the future, near-term years, to continue to be. And that will be to leave university with a training job, trainee contract style offer, to do SQE1, to start in their job, do their 2 years work experience, and an appropriate point during that 2 years to sit SQE2, get their results, and off they go with their badge as a solicitor. But to be clear, this gives us flexibility to do other routes as well, and allows you as employers, you as business owners, to develop the routes for your workforce that work for you, that work for your clients, and the way you want to package and deliver your services. So having talked about some of the things we do know at this stage, there's of course, with 3 years to go, still plenty of things that we haven't pinned down, that we haven't yet decided. We don't know the cost of the assessment yet. We've got some modelling, we're doing some work in choosing our assessment partner to be able to understand that. We've got reasonably good information, but we're not yet in a position to say this is the cost of the assessment and this is the cost of the training. The training market will develop in its own time, but let's be clear that we're already seeing educators respond to SQE, both here in the UK or in England and Wales, across the rest of the UK and internationally as well. Developing training materials, developing courses, developing outlines of courses so that they're ready to go, not just in 2020, but before that as well, because there are opportunities for them to innovate and deliver differently. We don't yet have sample questions for you, but we will produce them. We don't have the detailed form of the assessment, but we will give that to you. We want to make sure that we develop those with an assessment partner that has the relevant expertise, but also engaged with you, engaged with others as well, to make sure we get that right. So, some practical arrangements around the assessment. These are things that we have decided at this stage. There will be 2 exam sittings every year. We're trying to work out what the right months to do them is, what suits the academic calendar, what suits the law firm recruitment calendar. But we will start with 2 exam sittings each year. It will be available in both England and Wales. We also want the written tests, so predominantly SQE1, to be available internationally. Over the last 2 or 3 years, the Qualified Lawyer Transfer Scheme, the short form answer part of that has been available internationally, and it has doubled the numbers of people that are qualifying as a solicitor through that route. So understanding that the evidence tells us if we make something more flexible, if we make it more accessible, then we can increase the number of solicitors qualifying into England and Wales. And given the gap between the level of legal services delivered and the level of demand, we think that's a good thing for the people of England and Wales, but it's also a good thing internationally as well, because the more lawyers that qualify in law in England and Wales, the more that English and Welsh law will maintain its preeminent position in the world. We think over time we can develop more sittings in more place, but we want to get this right before we're too ambitious about international expansion. We want to make sure that marks are available to students. Those of you that have either recently been through A-levels or degree, or have got children that have, you'll know that increasingly students get a detailed breakdown rather than just a final mark for their degree or their A-levels. We want to map that. We think that's important for the students to know what they did well, what they were weaker at. We think employers will want to see that in order to understand the strengths and weaknesses of particular candidates. But we'll also be using a whole set of assessment methods and statistical methods to make sure that the standard is consistent over time. You'll be able to see that, we'll be transparent with the data, and that data being made available will provide feedback mechanisms to you as firms and recruiters and employers, and also to educators about how different sorts of training lead to different people performing in different sorts of ways. We will allow resets, but it will be limited, 3 attempts over 6 years, and if your trainee fails any part, they'll need to resit it. There'll be no shortcut because they were trying really hard. So we're currently consulting on the transitional arrangements, part of that rewriting of our rule book. If we do introduce it in 2020, then as I say, the last year on academic year on the old system is 1920. If you start before then, you'll be able to continue on the old route, subject to institutions wanting to offer that either as academic institutions or as law firms. But you will be able to transition your students onto the new system if that's what you prefer. I think they're choices for you to make. So there's some decisions for you, and perhaps we'll get into some of that on the panel discussion. When do you want to move to the new style qualifying work experience to get some of the flexibilities that the existing training contract doesn't have? Do you want to leave 2 systems running together? So some students on the old, some of your trainees on the old system, some on the new, or do you want to move them all onto the new assessment? Do you want to still offer some traditional training contracts, or do you want to mix things up? Do you want some apprentices, some taken in at 19 as paralegals, and you identify the ones that you want to either sponsor through an apprenticeship or sponsor through a degree? The opportunities are huge, and they're ones that we want you to debate amongst yourselves as well as with us, so that this is informed decisions that you make over the next 2 or 3 years ahead of the implementation of SQE. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Well, as you can see, in addition to Crispin, we have a panel of experts. Let me introduce them to you. We have Ryan Murphy, who's Dean of Aston Law School. Ryan is a specialist in European market law, probably in great demand at the moment. At Aston, they're considering some very interesting ideas around how to respond to the introduction of SQE. We also have Paul Clayton, HR Director of Capital Law. You'll recognise Paul from a starring role in the video that we've just seen. He did so well there, we thought we'd get him live and dangerous on the panel. He heads up the HR team at Capital Law. It's a firm in Wales with more than 140 employees. And finally, we have Cordella Bart-Stewart, who's an immigration and family law specialist, founding Stewart & Co. Solicitors. Cordella is recognised for her work as a social justice champion and is director and founder member of the Black Solicitors Network. Now, I'm going to give them each a very strict 2 minutes, and really we're running a little late this morning, so I'm going to have to enforce that. So should we start, Ryan, with you to give your perspective, really? Yeah.
I'll try to keep it less than 2 minutes. I'm in some ways dreading 2020. I think I'm going to take a year of sabbatical because everything is happening in 2020, isn't it? You know, introduction of SQE, you have your new SRA corporate strategy, you have prospect of Brexit, you have all these things happening in higher education, which the sort of face of higher education and legal education within that is changing. And this is a real opportunity for providers, such as universities, to review and renew their curriculum. This is the biggest opportunity they've had over the last sort of 40 years to do so. And to paraphrase Spider-Man very, very badly, you know, with great challenge comes great opportunity. And I was asked to talk very briefly about opportunity and opportunity for law firms. And I think what you will find over the coming years is that law schools will become much more receptive to input from the professions. We often invite you to join our advisory boards, give a guest lecture, and then say bye-bye to you for a year. The changes that will be brought about by the SQE will lead to greater partnership, I hope. I'm an optimist, which is unusual in academia. I hope for greater partnership between firms and law schools, because the standards that have been developed and the standards that are being assessed are your standards. And although there is great experience within academia, there are an awful lot of people who have never been in practice and who never intended to go into practice, who wanted to do learning for the sake of learning. And now we're going to break down that the silo that Crispin mentioned between the academic and the vocational, and we need much greater input into our educational offerings, both so we're better prepared to teach our students, but also so those students come out with the skills necessary to meet the competencies that you've asked for.
Thank you very much. Cordella, do you want to go next?
Right, well, thank you. Really, I think the thing for BMEs will be access, greater access. I don't know if you're aware, but BME students currently make up more than a third of LPC and law students, but that translates to less than a quarter getting training contracts. And we know about problems of supply and demand. However, the academics are usually really good, and it's the training contract that for a long time has been seen as the obstacle to BMEs and greater diversity in our profession. And I think as the government's recent diversity audit shows, that there are structural inequalities which the SQE, I think, can actually help address, especially in terms of social mobility. And as we know, the legal profession remains one of the most elite and hardest to enter, and we'd like to see it remain an elite profession, but not restricted to those from elite backgrounds. The introduction of apprenticeships and equivalent means is a good thing, useful for access, but risks creating segmentation and silos. We already have leading universities, law schools and law firms delivering specialised courses. And I think my expectation is that this will make the profession more accessible, while at the same time ensuring that on entry and throughout their careers, all solicitors are of a high standard, regardless of the path that they take. And it can address the hierarchy of legal education that will follow if we just have apprenticeships, equivalent means, and law degrees. But will show that candidates can be just as strong as those from the universities that the leading firms might traditionally recruit from. But also, we shouldn't lose sight of the candidates either. I'm a governor of a modern university. I think in this discourse, we often talk about ourselves and what we want from people, and we're not looking at the fact that these young people, as they mostly are taking on considerable debt, and then they then face barriers to entry to the profession. And again, we would hope that that could address some of this. It allows providers to be innovative and can tailor courses to meet the needs of the profession, and also the changes in delivery of the profession, things like AI, which we're all going to have to embrace at some time. It means that universities and employers, as you say, can work together to look at preparing the profession for the future.
Right, fantastic. Paul.
Thank you, Clive. I think the joy of working in HR is that we get to look at humans, but also the changing world of work. And there's never been a more interesting time actually to be in the HR profession. There's a great book that was released last year called The 100-Year Life, written by Linda Grattan. And it talks about, in the Western world today, there's a 50% chance, if you're born in the Western world, that you'll live to beyond 100. And what that means for the world of work and for professionals, it means it's totally changing. So we're in the age of longevity, and one of the things that Linda talks about is double, triple and quadruple careers. So we believe that the SQE will allow people to transition their careers at various stages through this long life that we will hopefully be leading. So lots of the commentary, I think, has also been focused on early in career, and I think it's great that the SQE will provide alternatives. We understand, you know, the debt burdens that are on students going through the traditional routes. So to provide an alternative is certainly a good thing. So with that in mind, I think it will create a broader talent pool, and a broader talent pool is a good thing. It's a good thing for firms, it's a good thing for clients, and it's a good thing for the communities that we serve as well.
Great, thank you. So there's a real wave of positivity I'm picking up there. Let me just ask you quickly a few rapid fire questions, and then can I just check, do we have our roving mics? Can you stick your hand up? Roving mics, okay. So we're going to have a few rapid fire questions, and then we're going to come to questions from the floor. So first of all, Ryan, I want to ask you, The SRA claims that the SQE is about consistent high standards. Others have said that they fear that it will simply dumb down. What's your view?
Well, academics aren't very good at rapid-fire questions, but I'll try my best. I think what will happen, I don't perceive it to be a dumbing down of standards. I think it's a change of focus for universities, that universities will have to focus on those core standards. And actually, they are only core standards. We're not saying that, particularly for those training providers, that that's all you are providing is a means of passing the SQE. That is a baseline standard, and what I'm more interested in is what we can add on top of that as education providers.
Okay, very briefly, either of you want to chip in on that? Dummy? No? Okay, all right. Fine. Paul, I want to ask you, what's your firm doing to prepare for the change?
Well, we're doing a number of things. So we are rethinking at this early stage of the traditional trainee calendar that tends to align itself to the academic timetable, because there will be change in terms of how people enter the profession. We're engaging with many schools, so schools at year 10 and above, and FEs and higher educations, because what they're saying is that they need to be informed by the profession to then inform government, as it is in Wales, in terms of what courses and curriculum can be provided to meet the standards. And we're also changing the way we attract talent. So in the way that we, on our website, for example, we are interested to hear from other professionals, people that are working in different sectors that are not necessarily solicitors, but might want to work in the legal sector.
Okay. Cordell, a question for you. What do you look for when you're recruiting for your firm, and do you think that having this consistent standard is going to help with recruitment?
Right, well, I no longer recruit because I'm a consultant with a firm, but I think for all employers, the base is probably what do they know, and what's their potential, and what can I do with this person. And I think that this route, the SQE, is something that will help with the what do they know aspect of it.
Will you have more confidence, all of you, that there will be, a genuinely uniform level of achievement that you can rely on? So you're not looking at individual providers so much and who's been studying where, you're looking, across the piece.
Well, I think the problem has been that at the moment that confidence is not there because of the range of providers and the different assessments that there is in the system. Whereas if you have one overall threshold standard for everybody, then that should bring that confidence.
Okay. All right, let's go to the floor. I've got more questions as well, but let's go to the floor. So please, if you've got a question, please raise your hand and we'll get to you as quickly as we possibly can. We've got a question down the front row, yeah. Perhaps you can just tell us who you are and then your question.
Yes, my name is Almona Chowdhury and I'm from Europa Law. Just a brief question as to why you're keeping the old system going until 2031. Surely it may confuse and perhaps it's unfair.
Okay, one for Crispin.
I think we've got to be fair to students that have already started on a particular journey. We looked at how long that needed to be. I think we came to the view really that if you've started on a particular route and you've made investment in that, you should be able to continue to do so. That can take a long time if somebody is, because of disability or being a carer or whatever circumstances, is doing part-time, then the end date under the old route might be 10 years or so away. But we also want to give people the opportunity to move on to the new system. We don't guarantee that those other routes will still, the education providers or firms will still recruit under them, but we don't want to take that away if people have started and made really important life decisions, particularly if it would have a negative impact on people with protected characteristics.
Okay. There was another question. Someone had a hand up. Yeah. Can we get a mic? Thank you. Again, could you please just say who you are and your question?
Hello, my name is Nick Gover. I'm from Garrett Law. One of the questions that I had, and Cordella, you touched upon this, was about social mobility. Now, the course itself, whilst there haven't been any figures branded around that, how much it's going to cost, some of the figures that have been branded around it are between £10,000 and £14,000. Now, that's wide scope. Why are you effectively replacing one sort of method of qualifying and these costs with another, which is of this similar sort of value, and at the same time you are getting rid of, or you have got rid of, the trainee minimum wage.
Okay, did everyone get that question? Did everyone hear that? Essentially, the issue, one that I'm really interested in as well is, is this new system really taking cost out of the, for the person who's seeking to apply and to qualify? Is it taking cost out, or is it simply replacing one set of costs with another, Crispin?
So it's a bit of both. This shifts some of the costs from university fees and LP fees into a much more transparent, here's the cost of assessment. So that's it's not new, there is assessment cost built into universities and LPC providers, but that will be very transparent cost. But it shortens the amount of time that people need to study. So you won't need to do 3-year law degree, LPC, 2-year training contract. You'll be able to mix them up differently, which will shorten the time. That reduces living costs, it reduces LPC fees, it allows people to combine differently, and I think that will reduce the costs. And I think if at the end of this it's more expensive to qualify as a solicitor, then we failed.
Okay. Will there be an element of earn while you learn?
Yeah.
Could there be?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's where I wanted to come in on that, because in terms of the costs, I think particularly the modern universities are doing a lot of work on degree apprenticeships, and so I think there'll be many more of those courses available where people are earning and learning, and so some of that cost is going to be absorbed.
Sure.
Just
come back very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, just on that point, I mean, apprentices aren't technically regulated by, say, the Law Society or the SRA, so that's still an unknown territory. You've got a lot of people that are coming into the profession, whether it be through apprenticeship programs, but you have no way of properly regulating it, how they're doing it.
So I think we do. We have an assessment at the end. We regulate solicitors. We don't regulate people that want to be solicitors. And we should not try and push people out before. They should be allowed to go through the training and working with, whether it's employers, apprenticeship providers, educators, get on that journey. They'll only become solicitors if they pass the same assessment as everyone else.
Okay. Another question.
I had just 2 brief comments. I think one of the great advantages is it moves the uncertainty of the cost. So even if the cost is the same, someone will take SQE2, for example, during their period of qualifying work experience, which for most people will be in a paid employment position, whereas at the moment you have the students taking the LPC with the gamble of the LPC. My concern, so that's a positive thing, my concern would be for SQE1 is if we have an emergence of crammer courses, which are costly and available to those who are able to afford them, which tends to be those from more privileged backgrounds. That would be my concern.
Yeah. Okay. The lady in the... I don't want to take all the questions from down at the front here, by the way. So we'll take the next one from down at the front, and then we'll try and go more broadly around the room. Yes. Who are you, sir?
It's Claire Buchanan from Smith Partnership.
Yeah.
The question's more for Ryan. We are one of possibly many firms that have to pay apprenticeship levy.
Yeah.
We've spoken to guys like yourself, and the highest level of apprenticeship levy that we can claim is on legal executives. So where do you see the apprenticeship levy going up until 2020 when this kicks in?
Well, the apprenticeship levy does not also have to be spent on training people for the legal profession. The apprenticeship levy could be used for a business manager doing an executive MBA or something like that. That's one way in which you could spend it in the build-up. But I do think the coming online of the higher level apprenticeship for solicitors, that standard, that will increase the mix quite significantly and allow firms of certain sizes to spend that apprenticeship levy. Universities will be coming and knocking on your door, I assure you, in the coming years, because the apprenticeship route is seen to probably going to account for, I've seen figures of 1/5 of the sector, of the education sector, not just for law, but around 1/5 of the sector will be people getting degrees through the apprenticeship route. That is, in one hand, that's great for universities and employers, and on the other hand, that's a huge loss of potential income for universities, and so people will be willing to help you spend that levy, I'm sure, if you go and knock on enough doors.
Quick question.
But you haven't found that.
Quick question, unless anyone else wants to come in. I've got a quick one for Crispin. Do you see the SQE, do you think it creates potential for the apprenticeship route to grow and expand?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, if we look back over the history of qualifying as a solicitor or a barrister, versions of the apprenticeship was the way people did it. And the sort of the formalised route of law degree, LPC, training contract is quite a recent thing. I think actually learning on the job and mixing up those different elements of studying is one very good way, and I think it's particularly a good way for people that have come from different backgrounds, more difficult backgrounds where they haven't had the same support at home or really top quality schools, because it allows you to combine all of those things and play some catch up as well.
Okay, good. More questions, please. Yes.
Angela Davis, Bellax Limited. Where does the qualifying period of work experience fit in with what we now have to do is offer a traditional training contract with all the legal obligations that implies?
It's the end of a formal training contract. The student will need to have 2 years' work of work experience. There'll be some constraints about how many they can't do, 600 placements for 2 days each. There'll be a maximum number. It gets away from the sort of the fixed term nature of it. So a paralegal might work for 4 or 5 years in your firm, and halfway through that, through your appraisal system, you say you could be a solicitor, and you develop them, and they take what learning they've already got and they add to it, and as long as they've got the 2 years, and you can sign it off. So it gives you and them much more flexibility, rather than saying, well, you've been working for us as a paralegal, we think you're really good 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in, now go and start a 2-year training contract, when they've already done that period. So it gives you much more flexibility to tailor the point of assessment to your individual employees when they're ready.
Okay. So there was one hand I saw somewhere in the middle. Yes, in the middle there, a hand raised I can see. Can we get a mic to you?
Chris Chandra from Clifford Solicitors. My question is regarding the pass mark of the SQE. Will it be set or will it change on a yearly basis like any other professional exam for applying for this CFA? And will it also be set based on the performance on that particular year for the students taking the exam?
Okay, we could spend a couple of hours talking about that. That's a really complicated answer. In short, the standard to pass will be the same every year. The exact mark and how we achieve that is some quite complicated assessment theory. We will look at individual questions and see how they perform compared to other questions in the assessment for both all candidates, but also for applicants with protected characteristics. So we make sure that diversity is built in as much as we can. You use quite a lot of different methodologies to make sure that the assessment pass is at the same standard over time and across the whole cohort. But we can talk in detail about that if you really want to.
Okay. We've got another question just here, I think.
Hello, Charlotte Talbot from Beach and Peacock Solicitors in Newcastle. I can see, because what you've said from an education point of view, that this is a massive opportunity to overhaul the whole system. But there seems to be very much focus still on areas such as wills and probate and criminal law within the actual SQE standard. It doesn't seem to be focused on commercial areas and such like that. Why is there still a focus on that when it seems to be the opportunity to have a huge overhaul out of those areas?
Okay, so the starting point is the list of reserved activities. So the things that Parliament has said only somebody who's a solicitor or other authorised person can do those activities. So we've got to make sure that people are good enough to be entitled to deliver that range of reserved activities. We're trying to think through, and there's some detail to work through on this, how do we make sure that the assessments on SQE2 are done in a way that gives trainees wherever they practice, whether they're practicing in a commercial firm or a wills and probate firm, equal chance of passing and developing their skills. So I think there's still some work to do around the context that we'll do with the assessment experts, and then we'll test and evaluate before we make final decisions. But I'd encourage you to look at the assessment specification if you've not already, because I think what you'll see is that this is about broad understanding of law and how to use law, rather than just, 25 obscure cases.
Okay. Let me ask a quick rapid-fire question to all three of our other... You've done quite a bit of talking, Chris, we won't ask you on this one. I want to ask you, no one I think is suggesting that SQE is going to be the silver bullet that cures the problems of access and diversity within the profession, but do you really think it will be a quantum step in improving things? Cordella, perhaps you first.
Well, diversity in the legal profession and the judiciary is a huge problem, and I don't think there is a silver bullet. I'm not sure how much of a bullet there will ever be into the problem, but in terms of, it's a step towards addressing the disparities that there are, and I think, and also discussion about how you can do it, how you can address it, and I know. And access to the profession is always going to be a big part of improving diversity.
Okay. Actually, before we come to Paul, let's do a quick show of hands. Who, knowing what you know currently about the SQE, who in this room thinks it is likely to improve access and diversity within the profession? Let's have a quick show of hands. Okay, that's maybe 20-25% or so. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that diversity in society is inevitable, and inclusivity is a choice. And I think this is a conscious choice by the SRA and by the legal community to improve access to becoming a lawyer. I think that it will enable professionals to develop further as well. There's a number of we have to engage at a much younger age, I think, with schools and education. I think the stat I read this morning is that 7% of the population are privately educated, yet 51% of solicitors are privately educated. So something that there's a disproportionate representation there that I think the SQE could possibly address in its first 5 to 10 years.
Ryan, if I'm someone who, a young person who previously perhaps would have been a bit intimidated, a bit scared off by the way in which what I'd have to do to qualify as a solicitor, will I have more confidence under SQE?
I'm less convinced that students or young people go to university with a knowledge of what it requires to become a solicitor, and so I think there's a great amount of a lack of information for young people out there in making those choices, and I don't think it's the formal assessment, and I don't think it's the curriculum, and I don't think it's all those things. Well, it's partly those things, but it's a combination of other things. The face of the profession looks in a very particular way. The language of the profession is a very particular way. The language of universities, the look of universities, all of those things need to change alongside the SQE to make a real difference. The SQE is one small but very important part of giving people an opportunity. But if those other barriers that are partly reside in the profession and partly in education and partly in society, if those aren't removed as well, the SQE will probably make a modest rather than a quantum difference. That would be mine.
Can I just come back on a small point?
Yeah.
And it follows up from what you said in terms of young people entering university and expectations. And for disadvantaged groups, there is a serious problem of retention. That once they've actually entered university, not finishing. And I think, and that is where I think the SQE can help as well in terms of giving someone an alternative that if you then find out the university is not for you or is not taking you to the path that you thought it could, all is not lost. There is another way of working around it.
I think maybe we've got time for one last question. Yes, gentleman on the front row.
My name's Manjinder Kang. I'm from Kang & Co Solicitors based in Birmingham. My understanding from what I've heard today, it's making it easier for participants wanting to access the profession easier, which is certainly a positive thing because I found it quite difficult to qualify as a solicitor initially. But looking at it from the other side of the coin, there are record numbers of solicitors qualifying. There was an article in the Gazette recently saying that the number of solicitors qualifying significantly outweighs the number of solicitors retiring. So if we're making it easier for people to qualify, certainly a positive step forward, but at some point there's going to be a problem on supply and demand as well. So the salaries are likely to go down. In the West Midlands, the average salary for a solicitor is about 35,000, which isn't very good. If the situation continues and we're getting record numbers of people joining the profession as solicitors, it could be a problem for the people that are already in the profession.
Yeah, well, Crispin, that's one for you, because it's a long-standing criticism, isn't it, that you raise the expectation of a very wide group, only a relatively small proportion of whom will go on to have successful, thriving careers in the profession.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems with the current situation is that people are encouraged, and then there's an artificial bottleneck, which is the cost of LPC and getting a training contract. I think by taking them away, we can grow the number of solicitors. Is that a good thing? I guess I would point to the huge numbers of individual people and small businesses that struggle to get legal services. They find them unaffordable, difficult to access, intimidating, not delivered in a way that they want. That is a huge opportunity, and more people coming through with different training, different backgrounds, different experiences, working in different ways can help to grow that. I don't think a regulator should say it knows the right answer to the number of solicitors that's needed or to what they should be paid. I think employers make decisions about how many they recruit, those sorts of issues. If somebody had said 30 years ago there's going to be 140,000 practicing solicitors, we'd think, well, they'll all be sleeping on the streets because there won't be any work for them. But it turns out you're really busy because when you offer your services, people want to buy them. So growing it, to me, is about reaching more people with more imaginative legal services.
Okay. Very briefly, literally 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would just say that I would take issue with the word easier. I don't think it's making it easier. I think it's